What happens when a queen consort dares to reach into the heart of royal destiny itself? Catherine's world was turned upside down when whispers emerged that Camilla had quietly tampered with King Charles's will. And what was meant to secure Catherine's future as the rightful queen consort was suddenly rewritten. The revelation struck like thunder on a clear night, unseen, unexpected, and deeply unsettling. At first, it was only murmurs that reached her ears, whispered confidences from those who lived closest to the palace walls, staff members who had seen unusual activity in Charles's private offices, hushed voices behind closed doors, and documents, handled with a secrecy that went beyond normal royal procedure. To Catherine, who had always trusted that Charles's will would reflect his duty and his mother's legacy, the whispers felt like daggers, sharp, cold, and impossible to ignore. Will had long been considered Charles's most important safeguard for the monarchy's future. It was never about wealth alone. It was about the preservation of order, continuity, and the crown's symbolic power. For Catherine, the knowledge that she would one day be the rightful queen consort was not simply personal assurance. It was the natural extension of Queen Elizabeth's final blessing, the legacy of Diana's memory, and the rightful expectation of the British people. Yet now, with Charles's health increasingly fragile, those assurances seemed to hang by a thread, vulnerable to manipulation by the one woman whose influence on the king had grown stronger with every passing day: Camilla. Rumors swirled that Camilla had maneuvered behind palace walls during Charles's weakest moments. It was said that during days of fatigue, when the king's body ached and his mind was clouded by exhaustion, she had leaned in with soft persuasion, reminding him of her loyalty, her sacrifices, and above all, her children. While Catherine believed the monarchy should be carried forward through William and their heirs, Camilla quietly pressed another vision into Charles's heart, a vision where her own bloodline was protected and her family secured positions once unthinkable. The most chilling revelation came when Catherine learned of a midnight meeting between Camilla and Charles's private solicitors. In the stillness of night, when the palace was meant to sleep, Camilla had allegedly summoned legally minds to Charles's study. Doors were closed, curtains drawn, and documents placed upon the king's desk, ready for his weakened signature. To those who saw, it was more than just administration. It was the rewriting of royal destiny under the cover of darkness. For Catherine, the thought of such betrayal cut deep. She sat in silence when the news was finally relayed to her by a trusted confidant. Tears welled in her eyes, not from the fear of losing jewels or estates, but from the deeper realization that the woman she had learned to tolerate, the stepmother-in-law who smiled in public, had struck where she was most vulnerable. Betrayal within the family was more painful than any assault from outside. Catherine's tears were quiet, her grief unspoken, but within her heart, fear settled like a storm waiting to break. And yet, as the days passed, the palace moved on as though nothing had happened. Publicly, the family smiled, posed, and waved, each gesture carefully measured for the cameras. Crowds cheered. Royal engagements unfolded without falter. But behind those grand walls, a storm gathered force. The secrecy of Camilla's act could not remain hidden forever, and Catherine knew that every secret leaves a trail. Every betrayal whispers louder with time. But to understand why Camilla would risk everything, we must step back into the palace. Corridors where loyalty and legacy clashed in secret. Behind closed doors, King Charles made a confession that revealed just how fragile his throne and his trust had become. He had lived long enough to know that the crown was as much a burden as it was a blessing. And in moments of weakness, when his body failed him and his voice grew faint, he admitted to those closest to him that he feared leaving behind chaos. His health, though carefully guarded from the public eye, was no longer the steady shield it once was. Each day seemed to press him harder toward finality, and he understood that the monarchy's future rested on the ink of his signature, on the documents that would survive him when he no longer could speak. For Catherine, there had been reassurance. Privately, Charles had promised her that she would one day inherit Queen Elizabeth's jewels, the symbols of unbroken continuity, and the authority that came with them. It was the late Queen's wish, carried forward by her son, to secure the crown for William and Catherine, to ensure stability in the eyes of the world. That promise was meant to be unshakable, a vow from a father-in-law who understood both duty and destiny. Yet as days passed, doubt began to cloud his decisions. He feared fractures within his family, sons set against one another, stepchildren demanding recognition, and a wife who would not rest until her own bloodline was written into the royal legacy. Charles's confession revealed that he dreaded division more than anything else. He had seen how quickly the public could turn, how swiftly loyalty could crumble if unity was lost. He admitted quietly that his heart was pulled in two directions: to preserve the monarchy as it had always been, or to appease the woman who had stood beside him in both scandal and triumph. It was this inner torment that Camilla saw and exploited. With well-placed words and carefully chosen moments, she pressed upon his weakness, reminding him of her sacrifices, of the years she had endured scorn, and of her children who had lived in the shadow of royal exclusion. She whispered that their futures mattered, that they too deserved protection, and that his legacy should be broader than the narrow confines of tradition. In those moments, Charles faltered. His mind was tired, his heart divided, and the weight of duty pressed like stone upon his chest. And so, quietly, almost without resistance, he permitted discussions to begin. Discussions that would give birth to what insiders described as alternative provisions. These were not minor adjustments, but clauses designed to shift power, to carve away pieces of Catherine's inheritance and place them in hands that history had never intended. To those who learned of it later, the idea was shocking. To Catherine, it would feel like betrayal. But in that dimly lit room, with only his advisors and Camilla by his side, Charles yielded to her influence, unable to resist the tide she had created. His confession was not one of triumph, but of defeat. A revelation that the king was as vulnerable as any man when caught between love and duty. He feared being remembered as the monarch who left behind disorder, and so he allowed Camilla's voice to shape his pen. Yet in doing so, he bound himself to choices that would haunt both him and the crown. His inability to resist her persuasion revealed not only his fragility, but the peril that now threatened the very future of the monarchy. And while Charles wrestled with guilt, Camilla was already setting her plan into motion. It wasn't daylight diplomacy, it was midnight power. Camilla's quiet steps through Clarence's house signaled more than routine business. She was about to alter history itself. While the palace slept, while the world believed its monarch rested in peace, Camilla moved in silence, her path shrouded in secrecy. This was not the time for tradition or ceremony. This was the hour of shadows, where decisions were made away from the gaze of courtiers, journalists, and even family. To those who caught a fleeting glimpse, it seemed harmless, yet behind those closed doors, a conspiracy was about to take root that would shake Catherine to her very core. The meeting was not scheduled. No official papers marked it on the royal calendar. No courtiers had prepared notes or briefings. Instead, Camilla summoned Charles's legal advisors to Clarence's house at an unusual hour, their arrival hidden from the usual procession of staff. In whispers, they were guided to the king's private study, where she took control of the conversation before Charles could even speak. She spoke softly, but her words carried weight, carving out instructions that would later reveal themselves as nothing short of a rewriting of the royal future. Documents were passed across the table, their contents obscured, and once marked with Charles's fragile hand, they were swiftly locked away in the palace's most guarded files. Even among the staff, the changes did not go unnoticed. Loyal aides, who had served the monarchy for decades, observed movements that raised alarm. They saw unofficial papers carried discreetly into the king's private study, their seals unfamiliar, their urgency unlike anything that had passed before. To some, it was merely an unusual night. To others, it was the unmistakable sign that something was being hidden from those who had the right to know. But none dared speak openly, for fear that to question Camilla's midnight maneuver was to invite wrath from the highest ranks. What made the night even more sinister was Camilla's determination to reshape not just her own future, but that of her family. Her insistence was sharp, unwavering. Her children, Laura and Tom, were to be protected within the framework of royal assets. They were not heirs to the crown. They were not part of the line of succession. Yet, through the silent reshaping of the king's will, they were suddenly being written into the story of the monarchy. For Catherine, who had believed that the crown's legacy would flow seamlessly from Elizabeth to Charles, and then to William and herself, this maneuver was nothing short of a betrayal. What shocked those who later learned of it most was the deliberate erasure of Catherine's rightful claim in key sections of the documents. Mentions of her future role, of her inheritance of Elizabeth's cherished jewels, of her symbolic place in history were quietly removed or replaced. Where her name should have been carved in permanence, silence now reigned. It was as though Camilla had not only sought to diminish her, but to erase her entirely from the chapters of legacy that Charles's will was meant to preserve. Even senior courtiers, those who traditionally stood as guardians of continuity, were barred from this discussion. Camilla made it clear. This was her domain, her decision, and her moment to secure her bloodline above all else. The monarchy had always been built on rules, traditions, and precedents, but in that midnight hour, Camilla tore through them with a quiet, deliberate hand. But when secrets are hidden so tightly, they eventually seep through the cracks, and Catherine's heartbreak was about to deepen. For Catherine, the revelation wasn't just about wealth or jewels. It was about trust, legacy, and betrayal by the very woman who sat beside her on the throne. When the truth first reached her, it was not through official channels, nor by her husband's hand, but from a palace insider whose loyalty to Catherine outweighed their fear of reprisal. In hushed tones, they revealed that key sections of Charles's will had been altered in secret, with Catherine's name either diminished or removed altogether. What was once promised to her, secured by both tradition and Elizabeth's private assurances, had been quietly redirected under Camilla's influence. To Catherine, the words landed like a knife. Inside the walls of Kensington Palace, Catherine's composure shattered. Shielded from William and their children, she allowed her emotions to pour out in silence. Her tears were not simply grief. They were the tears of someone betrayed from within, someone who realized that the crown she had been preparing to uphold was being wrested from her hands before it had even been placed upon her head. Alone in those quiet chambers, she wept not for material loss, but for the betrayal of a bond she had thought was unbreakable, the sacred trust between monarch and future queen. Her fear ran deeper than herself. It was the terrifying thought that her role as future Queen Consort was being erased from history. Every public duty, every sacrifice, every smile for the cameras suddenly seemed futile if Camilla's maneuvering could undo her rightful place. The anxiety weighed heavily. What if, when the time came, she found herself sidelined, replaced, or stripped of authority in ways no one outside the palace could ever fully understand? The monarchy's continuity depended on certainty, and yet, for Catherine, uncertainty now hung over every thought of the future. And in those moments of despair, her mind drifted back to her private conversations with Queen Elizabeth. The late Saudi monarch had once offered her words of reassurance, entrusting her with not only the jewels of the crown, but also the weight of legacy. Elizabeth had spoken of duty, grace, and resilience, affirming Catherine's place as the anchor for William and the monarchy's next era. Now, with those promises seemingly undone by Camilla's secret changes, Catherine could not help but feel haunted. Was she destined to be the second Diana betrayed, silenced, and left broken by forces within the palace itself? The shadow of Diana's memory pressed heavily upon her. Catherine feared history was repeating itself, that she too might find her life defined not by triumph, but by the cruel hand of betrayal. Every glance in the mirror reminded her of the expectations she carried, not just as a wife and mother, but as a symbol of the monarchy's survival. And with each passing thought, the weight grew unbearable. Yet she knew she could not cry out, could not expose what she had learned. To do so would risk tearing the monarchy apart in a storm of scandal it might never survive. So, Catherine swallowed her pain, buried her heartbreak, and carried on with the mask of composure that the public had come to expect. Her silence became her shield, even as it deepened the wound inside her. Yet Catherine wasn't the only one left shaken. The ripple effects soon reached William, whose fury would ignite the palace walls. When William learned the truth, he didn't hesitate. He confronted both his father and stepmother with a rage that shook the monarchy to its core. The quiet, composed, heir the public adored gave way to a furious son and a devoted husband who could not stand by while Catherine was reduced to a footnote in the very legacy she had worked tirelessly to uphold. For William, the discovery that Camilla had orchestrated changes to Charles's will was not merely a legal maneuver. It was treachery, a calculated strike at the woman he loved and the role she was destined to play. The moment he read the altered clauses, his blood boiled. Gone were the clear acknowledgments of Catherine's place as Queen Consort. The jewels, the authority, the sacred honors that had once been promised her were now obscured, rewritten in language that diminished her significance. To William, it was more than betrayal. It was an insult to his mother's memory and an attack on his wife's dignity. He stormed into Clarence's house, his words sharp, his fury unrestrained. Standing face to face with Camilla, he accused her of treachery, his voice echoing through the palace halls. He did not care who heard. He demanded to know how she dared to undermine Catherine, how she could twist Charles's will to elevate her own family at the expense of the rightful heirs to the throne. Charles, caught in the middle, was visibly torn. The father who loved his son was forced to stand beside the wife who demanded his loyalty. His face carried the weight of a man torn between duty and desire, his silence betraying guilt that only fueled William's anger. The room thickened with tension, a confrontation so raw it left even the most seasoned advisors speechless. For the first time in years, the monarchy's unity was exposed as fragile, its fractures visible for all to see. The tension could not be contained behind closed doors. It spilled into public appearances, where William's icy glare toward Camilla was impossible to miss. What once appeared as polite formality now revealed a Cold War unfolding in plain sight. Audiences who once saw smiles and handshakes began to notice stiffness, avoidance, and the unmistakable signs of animosity. The carefully curated facade of royal harmony cracked, and whispers spread like wildfire. Royal aides began murmuring about a palace war, a silent but vicious battle being waged behind the grandeur of tradition. In private, William made a vow he would never break. He would protect Catherine's honor at all costs. No document, no manipulation, no scheming could erase her place in history as his queen. For him, this was not just about inheritance or jewels. It was about justice, loyalty, and ensuring that Diana's sacrifices were not mocked by a crown reshaped in Camilla's favor. His resolve hardened with every passing day, and his fury became a shield around Catherine, who carried her pain in silence. But palace wars aren't just fought with words. They're fought with secrets, and Camilla held one more card up her sleeve. Beneath the gilded pages of the will lay hidden clauses crafted with precision, designed to blindside Catherine when it was too late. At first glance, the document appeared ordinary, a careful record of Charles's wishes for the monarchy and his family. But those who dared to look deeper uncovered something far more sinister. Lawyers close to the process quietly revealed that estates once destined for William and Catherine had been redistributed, redirected toward Camilla's side of the family with chilling efficiency. Titles and privileges, once the birthright of the king's direct heirs, had been delicately rewritten to include names that history had never intended to see inscribed in royal ink. The revelations grew darker still. Tucked within the text were clauses ensuring that Camilla's children Laura and Tom were not left as ordinary members of society, but granted privileges once reserved only for royal heirs. It was a quiet rewriting of bloodlines, an attempt to weave her family into the monarchy's legacy as though time itself could be rewritten with the stroke of a pen. For Catherine, who had devoted her life to preserving the monarchy's dignity and preparing for her role as Queen Consort, this was more than betrayal. It was the theft of her future, the erasure of her identity, and the distortion of everything Elizabeth had envisioned. Perhaps the most painful discovery was her absence from key ceremonial mentions, where her name had once been included, acknowledging her rightful position in state ceremonies and future coronations. Silence now lingered. It was as though the will sought to erase her presence from the monarchy's most sacred rituals, leaving her invisible where she was meant to shine. The omission was not accidental, it was calculated, a clear attempt to shift the balance of power in Camilla's favor and diminish Catherine's role in the eyes of history. The implications were chilling. For centuries, the monarchy had been bound by continuity, by the passing of traditions from one sovereign to the next. But now, history itself was being rewritten, not for the crown, but for Camilla's bloodline. It was a dangerous precedent, one that struck at the heart of what the monarchy represented. The whispers among palace staff grew louder. Had Charles truly approved of these changes? Or had he, weakened by illness and love, failed to grasp the full scope of what was being done in his name? Some questioned whether the king even understood the depth of the alterations, or if he had unknowingly allowed Camilla's will to be imposed upon his own. Then came the most startling rumor of all. Deep within Windsor, in a vault sealed and guarded by tradition, there was said to be another version of the will. A draft left unsigned, containing Charles's true intentions before Camilla's midnight maneuver. Insiders whispered of its existence, a document that, if revealed, could expose the deception and restore Catherine's place in the monarchy's story. Yet the vault remained closed, its secrets locked away, waiting for the right moment to break open the truth. But just as Camilla seemed to win, a force she didn't expect began to rise: Princess Anne. Princess Anne, the unyielding daughter of Queen Elizabeth, wasn't about to let Camilla's scheme tarnish her mother's legacy or Catherine's rightful future. For Anne, loyalty to the crown was not merely ceremonial, it was instinct, carved into her very being by decades of service and a lifetime spent at her mother's side. So when whispers reached her through her own trusted aides, rumors of secret amendments, hidden clauses, and Catherine's quiet despair, Anne's resolve hardened. She would not stand idle while Camilla dismantled the order her mother had fought so fiercely to preserve. Anne moved quickly, her approach precise and deliberate. She summoned those closest to her, demanding clarity, and pieced together a web of accounts that pointed directly toward Camilla's midnight maneuver. Her fury, though restrained behind her famously steely composure, burned bright. And when the opportunity came to confront Camilla at Windsor, it was described by those who overheard as icy and brutal. Anne, never one to mince words, accused Camilla of treachery, of meddling where no consort should dare tread. Her voice carried the weight of Elizabeth's memory, a reminder that the monarchy was not a toy to be reshaped for personal gain. Camilla, stunned by the ferocity of Anne's words, could not match her sister-in-law's force. But Anne's battle was not fought with words alone. She went directly to Catherine, offering more than comfort, offering her unwavering protection. In a private exchange that Catherine would never forget, Anne vowed that her mother's wishes would never be erased. The jewels, the honors, the future, that had been promised would remain hers, no matter what schemes Camilla set in motion. In that moment, Catherine felt the strength of a true ally, a woman who carried the iron will of her late mother, and who refused to let betrayal define the monarchy's path. Still, Anne knew silence would only embolden Camilla further. She allowed carefully placed leaks to reach select journalists, whispers that raised troubling questions about Camilla's true intentions. Articles began appearing with subtle hints, questions about the future of the crown jewels, speculation about the role of non-royal children in the monarchy's inheritance, and murmurs of unprecedented changes in the king's private papers. Though vague, the leaks struck their target. Public trust began to waver, and pressure mounted on the palace to clarify the truth. Anne also wielded her authority with precision. As the senior working royal and trusted custodian of protocol, she quietly blocked approvals that Camilla sought. Events, permissions, and ceremonial preparations that required her signature met with delays or denials, subtle but effective roadblocks that made clear Anne was no passive observer. Every move was calculated to remind Camilla that she did not hold unchecked power, not while Anne was still standing guard. Soon, the palace itself felt the ripple of her defiance. A quiet rebellion began to take form among aides and courtiers. Those who had once been too fearful to question Camilla found courage in Anne's example. Whispers of discontent turned to deliberate resistance, small refusals, subtle leaks, and a growing sense that Camilla's grasp on control was not as strong as she believed. What had begun as Catherine's private heartbreak was transforming into a wider struggle for the very soul of the monarchy. But rebellion alone wasn't enough. What was needed now was undeniable proof, and it would surface in the most shocking way. When an old letter from Queen Elizabeth II resurfaced, it exposed the truth Charles never intended to bury and left Catherine in tears. For years, whispers of the late monarch's private words had lingered, but nothing so tangible had ever come to light. That changed when Princess Anne, ever the guardian of her mother's memory, placed a weathered envelope into Catherine's trembling hands. Inside lay Elizabeth's own handwriting, penned with clarity and purpose, carrying the weight of a promise that reached beyond the grave. In those lines, the Queen's voice echoed as if she had returned. Standing beside Catherine, in her darkest hour, the letter left no room for doubt. Elizabeth's explicit wish was that Catherine should inherit not only her jewels, but the crown rights that signified her authority as the future Queen Consort. These were not casual words, but a command from a sovereign who understood the importance of continuity. She spoke of Catherine's grace, her dignity, and her unwavering devotion to William. She emphasized that the jewels were more than adornments. They were symbols of trust, guardianship, and the monarchy's enduring bond with the people. The Queen had written with finality, sealing Catherine's destiny as if she foresaw the very challenges that would come. But what made the letter truly haunting was its heartfelt tone. Beyond the formalities, Elizabeth revealed a tenderness rarely glimpsed by the public. She wrote of her admiration for William's strength, her deep affection for Catherine, and her confidence that together they would guide the monarchy into a new age. It was not just a decree. It was a grandmother's blessing, a matriarch's farewell, and a queen's sacred trust, bound together in ink that carried both love and duty. For Catherine, reading those words was overwhelming. Tears streamed as she realized her worth had been secured all along. The doubts, the whispers, the erasures that Camilla had forced into Charles's will suddenly felt powerless against the weight of Elizabeth's words. Catherine broke down, her body shaking with relief and grief all at once. She had been vindicated not by confrontation, not by anger, but by the unshakable authority of the Queen herself. Every line of that letter undermined Camilla's rewritten will entirely, stripping it of legitimacy and exposing it as the manipulative act it was. The letter's power did not remain confined within palace walls. Soon, it reached the public, deliberately revealed in carefully timed whispers that ignited sympathy across the nation. Newspapers splashed with headlines of Elizabeth's foresight, praising Catherine as the true custodian of the monarchy's future. Crowds rallied behind her, voices rising in defense of the woman the late queen had chosen. What had once been quiet discontent transformed into a wave of national solidarity. Camilla's influence, once so carefully protected, began to unravel under the weight of Elizabeth's enduring shadow. And yet, even as the letter solidified Catherine's rightful place, one question remained unanswered. The nation could cheer, the courtiers could whisper, and Anne could stand unyielding. But in the end, it was Charles's signature that carried the force of law. Would he dare to undo what Camilla had already set in motion? As the truth unfolded, the palace reached its breaking point. Charles, Camilla, William, and Catherine faced each other in a confrontation that would decide the monarchy's very soul. Behind closed doors, what was meant to be a quiet meeting erupted into an explosive clash. Voices raised and tears spilling as generations collided over loyalty, power, and legacy. William, his fury sharpened by weeks of betrayal, demanded the will be restored to Elizabeth's vision. He spoke not only as a son but as the heir, declaring that history itself could not be rewritten for convenience or favoritism. Charles, exhausted and burdened, broke down under the weight of it all. Torn between the woman he loved and the son, who embodied his future, he wept openly, his authority collapsing into raw human fragility. Camilla, cornered and exposed, lashed out with venom, accusing Catherine of scheming, of plotting to diminish her role. But Catherine remained steady, her silence more powerful than Camilla's rage, her dignity a shield that won hearts even in that fractured room. In the end, Charles had no choice. Pressed by William's unrelenting resolve and Anne's undeniable evidence, he signed the corrected version of the will, restoring Catherine's rightful place as the future Queen Consort. The monarchy emerged shaken, its fractures visible to those within, but the nation breathed easier knowing Elizabeth's blessing lived on. And so, while the crown may glitter, the shadows behind it tell a story of betrayal, loyalty, and a queen's final blessing, a story Catherine will never forget. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.